And ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege and pleasure to invite on stage Professor Amir Yron, the governor of the Bank of Israel. Professor Yron. So, Professor Yron, it's great to have you with us. You took up the role in 2018. If some of you might not know, Professor Yron came from Wharton, right, where he was a professor, lecturer, and took up the role of the Bank of Israel. Who would have imagined what a ride, or what a run, if we get this mic out, it's working, what a ride it would be with the global pandemic that would send the world and its economy spiraling out of control. So we're really glad to have you with us. And I'd like to start with, that one work? No? This one works. Okay. We got to get these mics sorted out. I'd like to start with where the Israeli economy stands right now, right? How are we doing after COVID? New waves might still be coming. What's your estimate of just the status of the Israeli economy?
I think by every parameter, Israel economy has shown great resiliency. It shows dynamism. By numbers, we've had, last year we grew by 8.2%. Even during COVID, even during COVID, we contracted 2.2%, which is one of the lowest contractions. Cumulatively, we've done very, very well throughout these 2 years. Everybody understands Israel has the Iron Dome. The high-tech sector has been our economic Iron Dome. Lord David Wilson mentioned it. We are 0.5% of world GDP. We are 8% of world unicorns. So the Israeli economy is almost back to what we call close the output gap, back to where it was prior to the pandemic. Labor market is very tight. We almost at the level of employment prior. Our prior estimates, we're going to come with the new estimates in the coming 2 weeks, have been that even in the next 2 years, we're about to grow around 5% or so.
So one thing that's definitely changing global economies right now is the war in Ukraine and Russia's invasion. Guys, we can't get these to work. So I'll just ask the question at least, and hopefully you'll all hear me. How does the war in Ukraine impact Israel today? How does it impact... Excuse me? Okay, got to hold it here. Oh, no, hold the antenna. Good instruction. Sorry. So how does the war in Ukraine impact Israel? And should we, for example, one thing that a lot of people are speaking about right now is exporting gas, right? Is Israel, we know, has found a lot of gas, is now becoming an energy superpower. Should we get more involved in gas or in the energy sector?
So great question. First of all, one has to understand, actually the minute the Ukraine crisis started, I had a team analyzing it. We had a team analyzing COVID very, very early on. Basically, Israel has very little direct exposure to Ukraine and even Russia. Our exports to that region is about 1%. Most of our, most of our exposure is what we call through secondary channels, through activity in Europe, and of course through the gas and grain prices. And those are obviously influencing inflation everywhere, but that's the primary exposure we have. As long as this crisis doesn't expand more and affects world trade more, our exposure is quite limited. In terms of your energy, obviously everybody understands now the value in energy security, and Israel has that through its natural gas. It also has, even in terms of prices, we have limited exposure to the volatility that all the world is seeing because of our long-dated contracts of gas. That's what the Israeli consumer is seeing, and that's why our inflation, this is another word about the Israeli economy, inflation is going up everywhere, but in Israel, inflation is slightly above, is 3.5% right now, slightly above the Bank of Israel's upper limit, but it's about the bottom 10% of inflation among the OECD. So
right.
It's significantly less. Obviously, energy ties among our region are very valuable. The Abraham Accords were mentioned, and these other things. But we have to understand that for Israel to export, we need to liquefy gas. That will take investments in Egypt, etc. But I think it's very important for us to have farther ties with the surrounding nations to work hard on renewable energy. And we have the ways to do that.
A lot of the grain, wheat, for example, comes from Ukraine, I think also Russia, maybe.
Right.
But are we facing a global food crisis also? Is that, and that maybe that will lead to a rise in cost of living and in prices for the average consumer?
So the OECD has put out a number that they're expecting the crisis right now to detract about 1% of growth in Europe and to raise world inflation by about 2%. And that encompasses basically the fact that energy prices are higher and grain prices are higher. And the big question is obviously the big elephant in the room, what's going to happen with this crisis and when will we'll go back to some kind of normalcy where prices will go back down.
Does the Israeli consumer need to worry?
Well, I think inflation, as I mentioned, is rising. It's rising in Israel a lot through this imported component. But one has to understand inflation in Israel has been lower, and it's still substantially lower than in other places.
One of the other problems, and I do want to move into inflation and interest rates also, but is the traffic jam in Israel's got a lot of traffic on the roads, and anyone who comes from Israel or is visiting Israel will experience that. But there's also traffic out in sea, right? We have dozens of ships that are waiting to offload and unload, and the supply chain problems that many countries in the world are facing. How's that going to impact the price that I'm going to feel as an Israeli consumer in my pocket?
The inflation we're seeing around the world is basically an outcome that coming out of COVID, there's been renewed demand by consumers, particularly both to goods and services, which met supply chain disruptions. And the initial assumption was that was going to subside pretty quickly, and we're seeing that that is taking longer to do. The Ukraine-Russian crisis is obviously enhancing those things, both supply chain, globalization, and that's going to prevail a little bit longer, push prices even higher than anticipated, several months ago before this has happened.
One thing, and maybe it's not nice to brag, but Israel's inflation we're about 4% right now.
No,
not even.
We were 2.8% within the target by the end of 2021,
okay.
And currently we're at 3.5%.
3.5%, so not even 4%, but 6% here, about 8%.
6.2%.
6.2%. Okay, that's why you're the professor, and I'm the journalist, so we get to fudge information. And it's about 8 something in the United States, right? So we're half of what these huge economic superpowers are. You're going to be meeting with the governor of the Bank of England, I think from here. That's your next meeting. If he asks you, so Amir, tell me what I need to do, what are you going to tell him?
I don't pretend to tell Governor Bailey what to do. We have discussion, and I think the main issues is really the Ukraine crisis sort of has made determining monetary policy more difficult. On the one hand, I mentioned the supply side shocks that are enhancing gas prices and grains. But on the other hand, I just mentioned the activity slowdown that might happen with it. And these are the balances that every central banker now has to face to make sure we are doing, as almost all central banks are doing, some kind of monetary tightening, to do it in a soft landing. And obviously, each country has its own idiosyncrasies, and each central bank has to deal with that.
So one of your jobs as the head of the governor of the Bank of Israel also has to do with the interest rates. And your deputy mentioned the other day that it seems like we're going to have to raise Israel's interest rate, which hasn't gone up. The Federal Reserve has done so. We have yet to do so. You're going to be making that announcement in 10, 11 days or so, beginning 10, 11th of April. What's going to happen?
Well, I'll leave what's going to happen to the actual announcement. But first of all, one has to take a perspective. We were one of the first countries to actually tighten our very expansive monetary policy that we went through with all the special tools that we put in during the pandemic. For example, what's called quantitative easing, buying government bonds. We've already slowed down mid-summer, and we actually finished it by December, earlier than many other governments. What we signaled in our last interest rate meeting is that conditions are ripe for a process in which we further reduced accommodative measure, which is another word of a process for raising interest rate. And what my deputy said is that given the extra pressure that is coming from some of the events and the realized inflation, the events we just took, the process may have to be a bit faster. And obviously, all these balances between supply shocks on the one hand, on the other hand, whether there is a slowdown on the other hand, these are the balances as discussions that are going to take place in the monetary policy meeting that's coming up on April 11th.
So if I'm understanding what you're saying, it's you're not committing to it, but we shouldn't be surprised if the numbers start to change. That's my interpretation. Okay.
I'll leave it here.
Ayelet Shaked, the interior minister, just spoke about how they're working on budget 23-24, right? We passed the 2-year budget. You came in 2018, and then we didn't have a budget for 3 years. How much did that impact what we're seeing, for example, housing costs in Israel? The fact that we didn't have a budget for so long. Is there a correlation between those two?
So, first of all, yeah, I think during the pandemic, just in general, a lot of the planning, a lot of the auctions for land, a lot of the production function in Israel, as the government owns a lot of the land, has sort of slowed down significantly. And that obviously has created more supply issues exiting out of the pandemic. To that, one had to add there were other plans like the Mechir LeMishtaken, which people were on the sideline and they came back to the market. We've sort of took down the special tax on investments for housing and then put it back up. That put more investors in. But fundamentally in Israel, we started with a big gap in terms of supply. That is the major solution for this housing issue over time, to provide not just one time. We actually see that Ayelet was here. This process of making the permits faster, releasing the land, creating efficient auctions, renewing inner city buildups. In the long hand, we're going to have to change the way we do real estate taxes, incentivize strong municipalities to invest in housing rather than in offices, because right now the real estate tax basically makes it good for them to do offices rather than housing. All these things have to take place, and in the medium and long run, supply has to be increased. The public has to believe that we saw actually that housing...
There will be opportunity.
Housing starts actually towards the end of 21 are at 63,000. That's an uptick. That's good. The public has to believe this is going to be sustainable for the medium and long run time. If you mentioned about the economy and the budget, I mentioned Israel is in a very good situation in terms of growth rate right now. What we need in the long term, and that's where the budget comes in, we need to invest in the long run in terms of education, infrastructure. Everybody who drives in Israel knows how long it takes to drive around, and also digitization of infrastructure to the periphery. Those are the key issues the Bank of Israel has put emphasis, and those have to take place in the budget. Education is key for mobility, for the Arab sector, for the ultra-Orthodox to gain into the labor force. We need to endow them with skill. Education is the biggest equalizer, and here it's a win-win situation. As those segments of society will increase, they need to be there, and we as a macro situation want them to be there, because it's essential for the economy to have them have these skills.
Well, Professor Amir Yaron, the governor of the Bank of Israel, thank you very much for being with us, and good luck in your meeting with Andrew Bailey.
Thank you.
Yes.
Have a good day.